Okay, so I welcome you to this panel on war and violence. I'll just briefly introduce the speakers, and then without further ado, we will get to the work. Okay, so I'd like to welcome Alexander Morrison of University of Oxford, who will be speaking first. Vladimir HAMED-TROYANSKY of the University of California, Santa Barbara. Daniel HEDINGER of Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. And Martin Thomas, University of Exeter. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for joining me here in the siesta session of the conference. I shall attempt to make my tones as soothing and as soporific as possible.
Is Alexei here?
I don't actually have a full PowerPoint presentation, and I'm not going to try to read out my paper either, as it's definitely too long. But I did want you to have a view of one of the, again, hero is not quite the right word, but one of the most prominent figures, both in my paper and in a book I recently published on the history of the Russian conquest of Central Asia, Vasily Alexeyevich Perovsky, here seen looking at his most dramatically Byronic. Perovsky is really the key figure for understanding Russian expansion in Central Asia in the first half of the 19th century. He was a veteran of Borodino, where he fought at the age of 17. He lost a finger. You can perhaps just see there's a little gold fillet on one of his forefingers there, which is a legacy of that battle. He was imprisoned in France. He was captured and imprisoned in France till 1814. He forms a key figure in what I call the Napoleonic generation, who really oversaw Russian expansion in the region. He was governor of Orenburg, Russia's main center on the steppe, from 1833 to 1841, and again from 1851 to 1856. The photograph here from the Turkestan album was taken during that second period of tenure, around the time when he captured the small Kokandi fortress of Akmasjid on the Upper Sir Darya, which was a key moment, actually, in the Russian conquest. It was quite a small fortress, but it was the first time the Russians had actually taken territory from one of the sedentary khanates of Central Asia in the course of their expansion. That was sort of the culmination of his military career. It led to the renaming of Akmasjid as Perovsk. It is now Kizilurda in modern Kazakhstan. But Perovsky's name actually lives on in the name of Perovskia, which is a steppe shrub that some of you may have in your gardens. And also, I believe, in perovskite, which is a mineral that is crucial for the manufacture of the new generation of solar panels. So he is somebody who's an imperial figure whose name still resonates in the present to some extent. While the photograph dates from the time of Perovsky, an imperial triumph of Perovsky's in Central Asia, the quotation that accompanies it, which also provides the title of my paper, comes from an earlier period of his career in Central Asia and commemorates an imperial debacle, namely the failure of the 1839 to 1840 Russian expedition to Khiva, which Perovsky planned and led. What does he mean here when he says ici il faut agir à l'anglaise, et c'est là d'autant plus que c'est contre les Anglais qu'on agit? Historians, I suppose, of an earlier generation who were keen on the idea of the great game between Britain and Russia in Central Asia would definitely focus on the second half of that sentence. But I'm much more interested in the first half, the need to act in the English manner. And what Perovsky meant by this was that Russia needed to imitate the decisiveness and aggression that the British had exhibited in invading Afghanistan the previous year. That actually happened long after the Russians had sort of laid the plans, the groundwork for their invasion of Khiva, but provided a sort of an additional incentive for it. More specifically, he was actually talking about a very particular piece of imperial statecraft. Just as the British had replaced Dost Muhammad Khan in Afghanistan with their own candidate, Shah Shuja al-Mulk, the Russians intended to do the same in Khiva, and again, quite explicitly in imitation of the British example. They had their own candidate for the throne of Khiva, the Khan's younger brother, Rahman Kuli Inak. The letter in which he made this statement was written to a friend during the expedition. In fact, quite shortly before its total failure as a result of one of the coldest winters that Central Asia had known over the previous 20 years, in which nearly all of the 10,000 camels which the expedition required died of frostbite and disease. So there's clearly an element of what we might call competitive emulation of the British in Russian expansion in Central Asia. I would say it's not direct competition for territory in the way that the Great Game narrative would have us believe, but there's definitely a sense that the British are an imperial exemplar which needs to be followed. Interestingly, France, although of course Perovsky had witnessed France's defeat at the hands of Russian armies in 1814, could also play such a role. So in 1835, when Perovsky was writing to Chernyshov, the war minister, advocating a punitive expedition to be launched against Khiva, the example which he invoked was the French conquest of Algiers in 1830. He said that, if the French were prepared to invade Algiers simply because their consul had been struck with a fly whisk, because it was a purely sort of trivial insult, how could the Russians do any less when it came to Khiva, which had been enslaving Russian subjects, raiding Russian caravans, and generally making a nuisance of itself in Central Asia, which clearly did not have the sort of necessary feeling of respect for Russian power. Interestingly, and sort of complete this imperial feedback loop, the French expedition to Algiers, in turn, had been at least partly informed by a report sent to Paris by Chernyshov, detailing the lessons learnt by the Russians during the Russo-Persian War of 1828. So, in a sense, the French learnt from the Russians, and then the Russians sort of piggybacked on the French example. And this, I think, is how inter-imperial transfers often work. So that theme I found, when looking at the Russian conquest of Central Asia, came up over and over again, that a decisive argument that could be used to justify expansion or to urge it was to point to imperial rivals and say, look, this is what they would do, therefore we must do something similar. Otherwise, people won't take us seriously as a great power. Elsewhere in the paper, I cite, some other examples of parallels and comparisons that were made by contemporaries, for instance, between the figure of Imam Shamil, captured by the Russians in 1854, the leader of resistance to the Russians in the North Caucasus, and Abd al-Qadir, captured by the French in Algeria in 1847. The parallels between the resistance the French encountered in the Caucasus and the resistance, the resistance the French encountered in Algeria and the resistance the Russians encountered in the Caucasus were very frequently invoked on this side. So there's really no question that the Russians are very frequently learning, at least from the British and the French examples. It's less clear to me how often that interest is reciprocated. The one area where it seems fairly clear the British at least thought they might have something to learn from the Russians was in the infliction of exemplary violence. While they generally have a rather sort of contemptuous, slightly orientalizing attitude towards Russian attempts at colonial administration, when it came to campaigns of conquest, you would often find a note of approval would be struck. So, for instance, Charles Colwell, the author of Small Wars, which was a sort of urtext for British, well, what we would now call British counterinsurgency, probably refers to the actions of General Skobelev in Central Asia more often than that of any other foreign commander, and in a tone of sort of admiring approval. An even more difficult question, one I've not answered in the paper, but will be interested to hear more about from all of you, is the extent to which the Russians were prepared to learn from their, if you like, non-European imperial neighbors, whether that's Qing China, Qajar Iran, or the Ottoman Empire. My impression is that that is quite rare. In the Ottoman case, there was some Russian interest in the millet system. There's certainly been suggestions that Russia's own model of the confessional state of ruling religious minorities through religious hierarchies was at least partially derived from the Ottoman model. Iran seems to have been looked down on as a weak state and one that was largely treated by the Russians as a client state. In the Chinese case, the Russians, of course, are actually seizing Chinese territory at this date, and certainly disinclined, I would say, to view Qing rule as an example, but they do seem to have a little bit more respect for Qing statecraft and diplomacy than they do certainly for their Central Asian neighbors. So I think I probably better wrap up there, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. The paper, I must say, is really just a rag bag of examples, derived from my past research, which I thought were relevant to the theme of this conference, but I hope very much to learn from all of you when it comes to questions. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It is wonderful to be here, and I'm very grateful to Cyrus Shire for the invitation, to the Pierre du Bois Foundation for funding historical research and for this conference. Thank you. And to David Mostafi Haller for impeccable organization. My paper today focuses on migration and violence in the borderlands of the Russian and Ottoman empires, and this paper has more questions than answers, as it attempts to connect many disparate events in Russian and Ottoman histories and to put historiographies of the two empires in conversation with each other. I'm a historian of the modern Middle East and the Caucasus. I'm currently finishing a book on the migration of Muslim refugees from the Caucasus to the Ottoman Empire between the 1850s and World War I. At that period, about 1 million Muslims fled Russia and became refugees in the Ottoman domains. And I'm making an argument that in this period, since the 1860s, the Ottomans constructed a refugee regime which preceded Eurocentric or Atlantic-centric refugee regimes of the 20th century. The Ottoman refugee regime, however, was not secular. The Muslim identity of refugees mattered, and also what mattered was the fact that they were displaced by European imperialism or national movements in the Balkans. That was the justification and the reason for the Ottomans' open-door refugee policy, let's say. While doing this research in the former Ottoman and Russian imperial archives, I noticed that in the preceding century, from the late 18th century onwards, migration was already happening in the Russo-Ottoman borderlands. It was in smaller numbers and with less state coercion. And the migrations were happening both in the Ukrainian, Romanian, Bulgarian borderlands, and also on the other side of the Black Sea in the Caucasus and Kurdistan. Ottoman Christians had been moving to the Russian Empire, specifically Ottoman Bulgarians, Greeks, and Armenians, and then Russian Muslims had been moving to the Ottoman Empire, namely Crimean and Nogai Tatars, Volga Tatars, and Kurds. Their migrations were happening during and after the Russo-Ottoman Wars, of which there were 6 since the 1760s. And we know fairly little about these migrations, especially the earlier ones. It seems that with the big exception of the Circassian expulsions from Russia, from the Northwest Caucasus in the 1860s, which was the bloodiest ethnic cleansing in Russia's imperial history, the bulk of emigration was happening during the peacetime. So these migrations had been prompted by the Russo-Ottoman Wars, but they were also bottom-up. People would usually leave on their own. The Ottomans and the Russians welcomed migrations of their co-religionist populations, but they didn't expel, respectively, Christians and Muslims until at least the 1860s. So in this case study, the state has this overwhelming presence in the history of the Russo-Ottoman Wars, but it has a more ambiguous agency when it comes to migration. And the absence of the government's agency is particularly interesting here, considering that we're talking about the two empires that aimed for centralization and that in their final decades were obsessed with managing migration. My hypothesis is that since the late 18th century, a new relationship between one's faith and subjecthood emerges in this vast space between the Aegean, Black, and Caspian Seas. one's religious identity comes to correlate with one's belonging to a specific empire, which is a new notion, especially for the Ottomans. And this idea comes with expectations of how safe a Christian or a Muslim would be in a given empire and how loyal they would be to that empire. Violence during the Russo-Ottoman Wars drives those migrations, but then the logic of those migrations breeds more violence down the road. So it's a vicious circle. And these migrations provide a new angle and an earlier timeline to the unraveling of the Ottoman Empire and the timeline, the history of sectarianism in the Middle East. Sectarianism is the central issue in Ottoman history because of everything ending in the Armenian genocide, but there's still no consensus about the origins of sectarianism. These migrations evidence earlier religious homogenization that would eventually become ethnic homogenization, practiced by the early 20th century as ethnic cleansing. These earlier migrations were also a precursor to a population exchange, first in the region and then globally. A population exchange was infamously implemented by Greece and Turkey in 1923, and then it became a global practice for a while. So what are the origins of a population exchange? Every Russo-Ottoman war since the early 19th century ended with a treaty authorizing frontier populations to cross the border if they wanted, which was popularly understood on the ground as a population exchange. And by the 1860s, when mass refugee migrations take place, borderland populations see those migrations as a state-sanctioned population exchange on a bigger scale, even though the Russian and the Ottoman governments would never call it a population exchange at the time. It is actually the Ottoman government that first proposes the idea of a population exchange after the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78. The second part of my paper is an early attempt to deal with the following historiographical conundrum. We have these two empires that are known for their violence towards the end and whose borderlands end up hosting some of the worst violence of the 20th century. And global historians readily acknowledge the parallels of those two contiguous land empires, especially when it comes to how they dealt with transborder populations that would be imagined as minority populations towards the end of the 19th century, as Alexei's paper showed. And yet, historiographies of these two empires developed with different questions in mind, and the violent events on different sides of the border have been rarely examined side by side, despite sharing many similarities. So I expand the timeline for this paper into the second half of the 19th and the early 20th centuries, and I look at the two pairs of events in Russian and Ottoman history. Their ideological underpinnings and provenance, I would argue, are precisely in those earlier migrations and religious homogenization that occurred in the same borderlands in the previous century. The first pair of events is ethnic cleansing against Jewish populations in Russia's Pale of Settlement between 1881 and World War I, and the Hamidian massacres of Armenians in central and eastern Anatolia in the Ottoman Empire in the mid-1890s. In both empires, the so-called Jewish question and the Armenian question were the hot-button ethno-religious questions. In the case of the Ottomans, the Armenian question was also tied to the Eastern question, the way the European diplomats imagined it. In both cases, the government did its share of dehumanizing that specific community in prior years, and the government also failed to protect it during the massacres. But the government did not order or direct the violence just yet. Both groups, the Jewish and the Armenian communities, found themselves outside of imperial protection. Their loyalty and imperial belonging had been publicly put in question in a way that it didn't really happen for other groups previously in Russian and Ottoman history. The second pair of events, further apart in time, it's Russia's expulsion of Circassians in the early 1860s and the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire. They are different in the two imperial governments' methods of cleansing. There's their expulsions versus explicit murder. They're similar in one of the outcomes, the near total removal of a population and then a very quick demographic transformation of the territories. I would hypothesize that Russia's actions in the Caucasus in the 1860s were the blueprint for the Ottomans 50 years later, because the Russians were the first to show that it was possible to expel almost the entire population and then to demographically transform the territory. And then the Young Turks of the Ottoman Empire, and then Stalin in the Soviet Union kind of would take this idea and run with it. So this is where some of my questions come in. Those events, despite their parallels and geographic proximity, do not seem to have direct connections, right? This might be a methodological question on writing transimperial histories or transimperial histories of violence. Also, what can transimperial histories reveal about migration and violence that global or regional histories cannot? How do we deal with a state that is already privileged in the accounts of violence and migration, and that might get another boost through the transimperial approach because it's such an obvious unit of analysis? And yet I'm not entirely convinced that the state was always a central agent in those migrations. And finally, my question is there a risk of exceptionalizing Borderlands? It is difficult to escape Borderlands when dealing with anti-imperial violence, and Borderlands are important. But can transimperial and anti-imperial histories offer something to breathe perhaps new life into the study of Borderlands? Thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, good afternoon. I have a PowerPoint, but first of all, I would like to thank the Fondation du Bois, but also Cyrus and David for this great conference and the opportunity to be here. And especially for me, it was now the opportunity to come back from Japan for the first time. As probably some of you know by now, we went to Japan late in 2021, and I'm still in some ways connected, in some very complicated and very German ways, to the University of Munich. But at the moment, I'm teaching at Doshisha University, and by mentioning Doshisha, which is in Kyoto, I would also like to mention Satoshi Mizutani, dear friend, but who was a co-organizer of this conference in 2017. We had in Berlin in 2017. And now at Doshisha, we just established a Center for Transimperial History. And one of the things we would like to do is have some kind of book talk series and meet the authors. So if you are publishing something on transimperial history book you would like to present, just let us know. And I'm very much looking forward to this cooperation and now a new base of transimperial history in East Asia. So the title of today's talk is The Second World War, a Transimperial History. And I just start with a small episode. Eve Curie left Mr. Gandhi deeply shaken, the daughter of Marie Curie, and by this point, and 8 years after the death of her mother, a global celebrity in her own right, just had a rare opportunity to speak, like several hours, to the Mahatma. It was the 78th of March, 1942. 3 weeks earlier, Rangoon has fallen. Last month, Singapore and the Japanese now really stood at the gate of India. Invasion seemed immediate. And all Gandhi was able to tell her was that he did not care who would win the war. Bewildered, Curie requested confirmation. So victory has no importance for you, she asked him. And Gandhi answered in the sense that you mean it, it has no importance. A few days earlier, she had already met Nehru, and the outcome was only slightly better. She later explained in her book on this journey, I quote her here, "When he and I mentioned the war, we simply did not mean the same thing." At one point of our conversation, he pronounced these astonishing words. "This war is our war, but you don't understand. In this war, Britain is on the other side." Just a few days apart, Nehru and Gandhi told her basically the same thing. She, as a quittance of de Gaulle, Roosevelt, and Churchill, had no idea of the purpose and as well as the essential character of the World War. And for the rest of the journey, a burning question haunted the 37-year-old champion of Free France with a Polish heritage at the same time. And the question was, had she, in the midst of the global war, flew around half of the world just to get such answers or responses of utmost ambiguity? So basically, I'm thinking that the Second World War was foremost a struggle between empires, fought for the expansion and survival of empires, and ultimately fought to decide which kind of empire, fascist or imperial ones, would dominate the world. However, both in historiography and in memory politics, the conflict is still and first and foremost understood as and described as a war between mostly European nation states. And it's obviously that thereby many dimensions of this conflict and many of its actors risk being left out. Recently, I think things really have begun to change. But what I labeled some years ago the imperial nexus of the Second World War is now more and more discussed in the literature, I think. Overall, however, a nationalized approach is often paired with some kind of Eurocentric perspective still dominate the historiography of the World War. In the following, I therefore argue that what we need for the Second World War is not only a globalized perspective, but a decidedly trans-imperial one. To put nationalized historiographies into dialogue with, by adopting a trans-imperial approach may be quite a challenge. However, concerning the Second World War, it seems to be simply an essential task. What would be at the core of such a trans-imperial history of the war could be one question. And Nadine and I proposed some years ago to bring different empires into one analytic field, and we had this already discussing imperial competition, cooperation, and connectivity, not as separate phenomena, but as an entangled process. And Cyrus asks some question how these three C's are connected. So for only a short answer for my project and from my side, I think I have to admit that for myself I cannot see a clear pattern in the form of a historical hierarchy between this categorization. So these three C's, I just use them as a way of approaching my question. And I did this in the last few years already in another project, and the book just came out last year, and it was a project on global fascism. And the basic thesis of this project was simply that the cumulative radicalization taking place in between Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome was the cause of the World War, and so on. And that we don't have to look to the transnational space in between these nations, but more to transimperial space in between fascist empire building by three nations. But then I thought about the problem, how to apply these approaches to a broader history of the Second World War. And the most challenging question for me in the last years was just how to write such a history. And then I came up with the idea to just follow Marie-Yves Curie's around or attempted around the world trip. She undertook this trip in late 1941, and then it was cut short because of Pearl Harbor, and she had to return the same way. And the idea now will be to focus on 6 different transimperial hubs or focal points, all sous les tropiques, all in the southern part of the globe, in the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. And this is all connected to for example, the colonial aviation infrastructure, which was built in the interwar years by the French and by the British. And here's just a poster of one of the planes she is using for her trip. So for a very short conclusion, because I'm running out of time, I mean, it's quite obviously how this story is about transimperial connectivity, and it's also obviously about competition and cooperation between Great Britain, the United States, Free France, and Vichy France, and the Axis power. But there are also bigger issues, obviously, which can be discussed by this framework, I think. It's first of all the space of the Second World War. Where is it taking place? And we see here how important the colonial connections were at a certain point. This was a very shifting setting all over the war, but it was taking place in the colonial space in many ways. And then also the chronologies of the war will change, because it's quite obviously starting earlier in the non-European sphere, in Manchuria and Ethiopia and so on. So that would be the second point. The third point, you just can look at different actors. I mean, these are still on a quite high level, Gandhi, Curie, Nehru, and so on, but they are coming from a very different field, and that's connected to the first, to the last and fourth point, that transimperial history would potentially complicate and complement and also change the moral and straightforward narrative about the fundamental nature of the Second World War. And for me, it has the effect. I was really writing about Axis empire building, so it was very clear who are the good and who are the bad guys. But if you are looking from this direction, everything becomes a little bit more complicated, and I'm not sure at the moment with whom I should side when I'm narrating this kind of encounters in the colonial sphere of the Second World War. So it has the effect on me that I'm just leaving a little bit the comfort zone I'm used to. So for a final conclusion, probably in the title, I ask if there is a transimperial history of the Second World War. After all, I think I could have done without the question mark. The Second World War was transimperial by nature, and therefore a transimperial history, I think, but a history which still has to be told. And yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, we have a little technological difficulty. Unless anyone knows how to juggle, which we would be open to, we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A, and then when Martin joins us, we'll pause and return, if that's all right with y'all.
Do you have the iPad for the...
I don't have the iPad.
So we just start with it.
Okay, all right. Unless this is the iPad. No, okay. Okay, yes, in the...
Thank you so much for these papers. This is all very interesting, and I have a couple of questions that are somewhat interrelated. But my first question is for Alexander. So you hinted at, and I think there has been a lot of work on this, but if the Ottomans provided a model for ruling these diverse populations or confessions in late imperial Russia, do you have any sense of why this is specifically for Muslims, like Sunnis and Shias, rather than for existing Jewish populations, which in the Ottoman system, the millet system, has a specific, right, it includes the Jews as one of the recognized groups. And just strangely, I've never thought of that before, but in terms of then when Vladimir was talking about the sort of like mirror of the Jewish question in Imperial Russia versus the Armenian question in the Ottoman Empire, I sort of thought about it as to like why we don't see Russia ruling its Jewish populations through that type of system. So that's just a food for thought kind of question. And then, so Vladimir, I have a couple of comments and questions for you. So if I understand correctly, in the 18th century, you're arguing that in the 18th century, beginning in the 18th century with all of these wars between the Ottomans and Russia, that you see political rights being tied increasingly to confession, right? And that, so I wonder then how this might complicate arguments made by Russian historians about how Russia is becoming a Muslim power in the 19th century. Do you see that as a contradiction? For that, there's this historiography of making that type of argument. And then I have a question about terms and concepts. So if we think about moving back the idea of population transfers and also the rise of sectarianism to an earlier period, right? Does this work to, like, do these terms work in an earlier period, right? Is population transfer the same thing happening in the 18th or early 19th century versus at the end of empire and the rise of nation states and the unmixing of peoples? Or is there a different logic driving the types of population transfers that are happening? And then in the sense of, like, again, with sectarianism, is it tied to a type, is this more like sectarian conflict versus sectarianism with the association of the implications of specific political rights? But in both of these cases, does this, I'm not sure if I can't quite wrap my head around some of the questions you asked. I mean, I'm thinking about it also, like, in terms of, is this interimperial, is it transimperial? I feel like there's a really productive opportunity for comparative imperial histories here. But if we move these kind of, if we look for the roots of confession of sectarianism and population transfer earlier on, might this be a good way to also challenge some of the ideas of the ruptures of the end of empires and the rise of nation states and the specific types of violence that emerge in the post-World War I period, right? Would these questions do that type of work? Like, would we be able to, because there's such an argument in the case of the Russian and the Ottoman and these multi-confessional empires, right, that the nation state's logic of homogenization is so different from the multi-confessional empire. So are you arguing then that we actually see this kind of push towards that homogenization happening earlier? So I'm sorry, it's a lot of questions. You can answer whichever you choose, and we can also talk about a lot of this later.
So it seems we have our ghostly visitor. So why don't you go ahead and try to answer that question, just so then, and then we'll pause, and then we'll have Martin, and then we'll pause again, and then we'll take questions. Does that work? So.
So thank you, Lale, for the question. The short answer on the Jewish community is I don't know, unless it's to do with I suppose, the more generalized hostility of the Russian state towards its Jewish minority, which is always, I guess, more pronounced than really for any other group. I mean, they get treated in different ways, for instance, by being classified as inarodsi, but still being liable for military service. That's also more or less unique to the Jewish population. I would say in chronological terms, I don't think if there is enthusiasm for the Ottoman millet model. It's not really a late imperial phenomenon. I think the high point comes between the 1770s and perhaps the 1830s, 1840s. So it's from Catherine the Great's reign to the earlier part of Nicholas I's. And increasingly from the 1860s, at least, onwards, they're less and less enthralled, I think, with this confessional model. This is where I part company with Robert Cruz on that question. Which is why it's never extended for the Muslim population to Central Asia or to the steppe, to the areas that they conquer in the second half of the 19th century.
Vladimir?
Thank you so much for these questions, Lale. How does this complicate Russian historians' view about the kind of like the rise of the Muslim Empire, Russia's Muslim Empire in the 19th century? I would say that if anything, those migrations that are happening starting in the late 18th century, the fact that Muslims start fleeing, that there's this ingrained idea that no, we do not belong in Russia's state because it won't protect our freedoms, I think potentially some of the policies in the 19th century by Russia are a response to those migrations. To stem emigration, to persuade Muslims that no, you should stay, you will be okay there. And then the Russian government starts sponsoring all those different initiatives, including via the imams persuading some Muslim populations that actually Russia can be Dar al-Islam, the domain of Islam, because your rights are protected here.
But aren't the bulk of the migrations happening in the second half of the 19th century?
They would be, but I mean, I guess at that point the dynamics are already difficult, and because the bulk of migrations happens after the ethnic cleansing, like it kind of becomes a different story. Whereas many of the migration religious policies for Muslims were put in place earlier than that. But in terms of the different terms and whether we can use them in this earlier period, population transfer, I wouldn't, because it wasn't a state-sanctioned population transfer. It wasn't state-sanctioned population exchange. Although I see that by the 1860s, people on the ground, both Muslims and Christians in the borderlands, perceive it as a population exchange, even though the governments would not call it that. In terms of sectarianism, I would not call it sectarianism just yet, right? So given the historiography in the Middle East and the Ottoman field, right, sectarianism is something typically associated with what is happening in the Ottoman Levant, starting in the 1860s. There's also sectarianism put in place politically, where sectarian differences codified by the Ottomans and also by the European powers. We don't have any of that yet. So I would say it's kind of sectarianization that is between, let's say, sectarianism from the late 19th century in the Middle East and perhaps confessionalization, right? Also from the Ottoman Empire, the, I guess, 15th and 16th centuries, when different empires get this affiliation with different religion, and they codify the difference of what a Sunni Muslim is or what a Shia Muslim is internally within the Ottoman Empire and Iran. So I would put it somewhere in the middle there. In terms of the nation state, I would not argue that this is the origin of the nation state. This is going way too far. But I would say that religious homogenization eventually led to ethnic homogenization, which is, of course, the core part of nation-making in Eastern Europe and part of the Middle East by the late 19th century. Thank you, Lali.
Okay, thank you. Martin, you can join us. I suggest the panelists just remain, honestly, unless you want to see his, well, do as you wish. But I'll go down and I'll come back. Martin, are you here? Can you hear us?
Hello, Caroline. Yes,
Hi.
I can hear you. Could you hear me? Hi.
We can. Yeah, can you say something again, just to? Okay, we see your slide. Go ahead, Martin. We cannot hear you. Je sais pas. We lost our friend.
Hello, can you hear me?
Now we can. Hi, yes. Go ahead.
Hello.
Now you only have 30 seconds to talk. That's it. Sorry.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe for the sake of all my panelists and everybody in the audience, I apologize heartily. Thank you to everybody for organizing and for your patience. But let me just say very briefly that my paper concerns lots of those individuals that you can see on the screen there, who are variously some of the leading anti-colonial insurgent figures of the early 1960s, and the pathways by which the French continued to interact with them, whether as enemies or increasingly as partners. I won't go into great detail about that now. The paper I submitted asked lots of questions about the research I was doing and the problems I'm encountering, some of which are inter-imperial, some of which are trans-imperial. But I think for the sake of everybody else, I will perhaps just stop there and allow you to, if you would like to, ask me questions about any of that during the session now. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Martin. And indeed, since the papers were online, if any of you have questions about Martin's paper, please ask. Before we take more questions, I have a question from the iPad. And let's see. Oh, no, I lost it. Sorry, Moritz. I can't find. I just lost your question. We'll come back to it. Okay. David, can you... This is a difficult world, you guys. Okay. Let's see. We have 1, 2, oh my. Okay. So actually what we're going to do is literally go in geographical order. So we'll start with Cyrus, and then we'll have the questioners wind up. So when... You want to go last? Okay. So we'll start here in this corner, and then we'll just proceed through the aisles, if that's okay, in sequential order. Okay? Yeah. So just keep your hands up when the row comes, when it comes to your row, and then they'll go by row. I think that works best because there are about 12 questions in the audience. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. The question is for Vladimir. So you mentioned that the Russian actions in the Caucasus were a blueprint for Ottomans in Eastern Anatolia. Would you contextualize the Russian actions into the Danubian provinces and later in Bulgaria as part of that, and even go as far as, you know, the actions of Russian proxies in the Balkan Wars, World War I, as part of that trajectory?
Is there anyone else in that row? Okay. Then we'll answer by row as well, I think.
Thank you. So my question is a bit related. It touches the Caucasus as well. So it's, again, to Professor HAMED-TROYANSKY. So I wanted to ask about the Russo-Ottoman borderlands today and trying to understand what are some of the lingering things from the past that are still alive. You know, especially looking at Armenia, Georgia, those countries are still in a mixed feelings towards Turkey, sometimes trying to get closer, sometimes trying to distance, and then there is, of course, the present influence of Russia. So what would you say, what are some of the lingering points still in the minds? I mean, of course, the genocide, but what other issues are there lingering in the background that we can still kind of feel vibrating in the present? Thank you.
Okay, Vladimir, I keep on pestering you on your subject. And when you were talking, I was wondering how you can conceptualize this trans-imperial process you wanted to conceptualize. You were talking about migration, and I was wondering whether this concept of biography, imperial biographies, we were discussing this yesterday, could be of any help in that context. You certainly know this great book of Michael Khodorkovsky, Bitter Choices. And in that book, he portrays a Chechen officer who is changing the camps between the combatants, between the Chechen camp and the Russian camp. And this is trans-imperial history in the making, I think. So I wonder, are there actors whom you could really identify and why they changed the camps, for example, between the Ottomans and the Russians? Is there a way to sort of more get down to the anthropological dimension of this whole forced migration process?
Okay, thank you. So let's let our panelists respond to that row, and then we'll move forward. Oh, there's another row. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm in a good row here.
You are. You are.
You didn't want to.
Very curious row.
Yeah.
I like it.
So, a couple of questions. First of all, Vladimir, and what about Surgun? Would you question or would you add this Ottoman policy, which goes way back, to these events that occur? And as far as the genealogy of what comes first, in terms of the Russian example, I'm following the question that was asked down the row. Really, do you have good evidence that there was some kind of imitation effect of the Ottomans from the 1860 ethnic cleansings? And thank you very much for the distinctions you carefully made between ethnic cleansing, the Hamedian massacres, which I would say are what I would call, this is a terrible term, exemplary massacres. That is, Armenians, stay in your place. This is what's going to happen to you. We're not going to get rid of you, but just don't make trouble. And the genocide, of course, which is carried out by forced assimilation, that is Islamization, deportation, and mass killing. It's a very different thing. To Daniel, really, do you have trouble choosing sides in World War II? I would think carefully about that. Not that you have to choose between Stalin and Hitler necessarily, but it seems to me that even as a historian, we may want to be careful about making those kinds of moral distinctions. It seems to me it's clear that even the Soviets, for all the horrors of Stalinism, ultimately they were on the right side, and they saved Europe and the world from fascism and for capitalism and liberal democracy. So, the choices aren't that difficult.
Okay, excellent row. Let's have our our panelists respond. Go ahead. Daniel, you want to start?
I should answer to this.
Yeah.
I had an easy answer in the sense that the fascists were the bad ones, and I will still stick with this narrative. But it gets more complicated if you don't look to Churchill and Hitler. And if you look to Churchill in a colonial setting of the British Empire, or if you look to this encounter between Curie, champion of free France and representing the Polish side of the story, and Gandhi, then it's getting a little bit trickier, because in most of the literature, post-colonial studies and so on, these are quite important figures also. So there is a in-between, and especially in these middle years of the Second World War, when the globalization of the war has already taken place, which is a process from the late 1930s on until Pearl Harbor and Japanese entry into the war, and also some kind of totalitarianization of the war is taking place until this moment. But I still think, and these are some of the big issues. For example, now in Germany, if you look to the Historikerstreit 2.0, the so-called new version of a conflict, which is really how to place the Holocaust and the colonial history. Where is there a nexus or isn't there a nexus? And I think the question until now has been addressed very much on national level and on national continuities. And if we look to these trans-imperial settings, things aren't that clear. At the end of the day, I would still stick with the book I've written, and in the book, the fascists are the bad one. Yeah. And I think you can also show this by numbers. They just killed many more people. But nowadays we have this discussion about the British Empire and India, for example, and how bad was it? And some people are going very far by claiming there isn't a big difference to the Nazi empire. pointing in this direction, and this you can find similar opinions from the late 1930s on. I think that's an important part of the story too.
Thank you so much for all the questions. Okay, I'll start in the same order. Leila's question. So I think what Russia did in the Caucasus in the 50s and in the 1860s, it was very important, and the consequences of those actions, it was an ethnic cleansing in the Northwest Caucasus. The consequences were always in front of the Ottomans' eyes because there was about 1 million refugees from that region in the Ottoman Empire, so the Ottomans were very well aware of what happened then. Like, we don't have much evidence that they were implementing that direct same thing in the Armenian genocide, but I don't think we should dismiss that potential link. Of course, what happened later, what happened on the Balkans front, that there are a lot of direct links to the Armenian genocide. So the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78, the independence of 3 Balkan states and the autonomy of Bulgaria. From 1878 onwards, the Ottoman Empire starts obsessively counting people living on its borders. It learned the lesson of the war that the demographic ratios and who is the majority and the minority, it matters because later on, people will lay claims on the territory on the basis of those demographic ratios. So they're learning from the Russians in many ways of what Russians and their allies are doing in the Balkans after 1878. There's also a fascinating parallel to Alexander's paper. When the Russians set up the administration of Bulgaria after 1878, and they're essentially ruling Bulgaria for about a year, they're looking at at what Russians are doing in Central Asia, and the papers from Central Asia quite literally traveled to Sofia, right? And in your paper, we've learned that the Russians learned about the Muslim question. They were studying how the Ottomans were doing it for Central Asia, right? And then the Russians are kind of doing this in the post-Ottoman Bulgaria. So there's like a loop, essentially, of how to treat the Muslim question and the language of the Vakif in Bulgaria. And then, of course, the 1912-1913 Balkan Wars. Again, everyone is counting populations, and that is an essential part leading up to the Armenian genocide. In terms of the lingering things from the past, I will just mention one example that is fresh in my mind. What I see starting in the late 18th century and then throughout the 19th century is the hardening of communal boundaries. So the world of old, with this ethnic and confessional diversity, is getting smaller and smaller. And I would say that that's what continues throughout the 20th century into the early 21st century. That taking the Caucasus, for example, that it's impossible to imagine an Armenian or a Georgian or an Azerbaijani that would have different identities other than just this one national homogeneous identity. So that's kind of the direct link I see to this research. In terms of the beta choices and the imperial biographies, I would love to find one biography through which I could tell this entire story. I think an imperial biography is an excellent kind of foray into a transimperial history. I'm working primarily on migrants and refugees, and there are the problem, of course, is that many of the refugees do not leave written sources, so we have very little evidence to work with. I work with refugee petitions and private letters, and so through some private letters, I can construct kind of imperial biographies of individuals or individual families, but it's not quite what Khodorkovsky was working with in Bitter Choices. But I see a lot of potential there. And then finally, Ron's question about Surgun. Yes, Surgun, the Ottomans practiced Surgun as essentially internal colonization for several centuries. They would dispatch some of the populations, especially nomadic populations, to guard roads in specific places in the empire. So it was a way of internal colonization. What is fascinating is that they're taking this practice and they're applying it to Muslim refugees throughout the 19th century. So the Muslims who are incoming from Russia, they are also eventually being settled in strategic places to guard certain roads. After 1878, right, the Ottoman strategy for refugee settlement changes, and refugees are often settled around Istanbul to change the demographic ratios around Istanbul, or on the borders between Anatolia and the Levant, or in the Balkans, or even in Eastern Anatolia. And then in the 20th century, the meaning of Sürgün changes again, and those Muslim populations from the Caucasus and Crimean Tatars, they refer to their displacement from Russia as Sürgün. In fact, in the 20th century, almost every term in Ottoman Turkish and then modern Turkish kind of changed up its meanings a little bit. They became much more secularized, right? And Sürgün, it's one of those terms that kind of it becomes more of a displacement. Literally most terms, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to channel Moritz real quickly and ask Alexander a question, and then we'll move to the next row. Okay, and just everyone, if we can try to practice the art of brevity, both in asking and answering. We still have about 25 minutes, but there are still over 10 questions in the audience. So, okay, so we have about 30. So Moritz asked to Alexander, a great panel, thanks to all members. Alexander, perhaps you could elaborate further if the Russians also looked to foreign powers and practices when it came to the nitty-gritty of the logistics of imperial warfare and conquest campaigns, including questions of the use of beasts of burden, the need to buy or levy supplies from the local population, etc. And he references Michael Mann's work on logistics, the sources of social power. So can you answer that, Alexander?
From the case that I know best, which is, of course, the Russian conquest of Central Asia, they're not really looking to foreign examples. What they're relying on is basically Central Asian expertise, because logistics in Central Asia means baggage animals and it means camels, to return to a topic that's very dear to my heart. Basically, Europeans don't have any expertise when it comes to rearing or managing camels. It's pastoralists who know how to do this. So, the Russians are certainly drawing upon sort of, if you like, extra imperial knowledge to do this, but it's coming from the local Kazakh population, primarily Kazakhs who sort of, in principle at least, acknowledge Russian sovereignty, and also to a lesser extent from the Turkmens. But I've not come across instances where they're kind of looking to say the British example of, not least because British camel management was actually much worse than Russian camel management was pretty bad, but British camel management was really appalling.
Thank you. Okay, this row, we're going to start along this row now. Yep. Great.
My question is for Alexander. So I'm wondering whether you could comment on whether there might be structural or less tangible underlying mechanism through which these mutual borrowings and the flows of ideas happen. Listening to your examples, one thought that occurred to me is, do these things happen spontaneously and on the basis of individuals, or are there underlying legal, structural, intangible ways in which these things happen? And if I may suggest, one way that occurred to me is treaties, the signing of treaties, which are typically reciprocal and mutually binding. And I wonder whether or not that they might have an effect of providing some kind of normative framework for how empires conducted themselves. And so trying to get away from the sort of great men way of looking at history and thinking more about processes.
Okay, thank you.
No, that's, sorry.
I just have a quick question for Daniel, and thinking about World War II as an inter-imperial war, and whether that just means fascist, anti-fascist empires. I'm wondering if you can open that up a little bit, because if you think about the war in Asia, it really is 4 wars that became kind of concatenated or synchronized. And one of them was the war between the American Empire and the Japanese Empire over the Pacific. Another one was the war between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire over the Russian Far East and Manchuria. A third was the war between the Japanese Empire and the European colonial empires in Southeast Asia. And then the fourth was the Sino-Japanese War, a war between Japanese imperialism and Chinese anti-imperialism that other imperial powers, the British, the Americans, the Germans, the Russians all kind of intervened in at different points. So I'm wondering if there's a way in which you can think about, the European theater as multiple imperial wars that then kind of synchronized and made it into one global war of many empires. Thank you.
Just to add on to that for Daniel, what does that mean for chronology? You mentioned that in the paper. I was hoping you could expand on that a bit, on what thinking of World War II as a transimperial history means, especially for the end point, perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, panelists, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very important question concerning the chronologies. And I think in the book called The Axis, I was much more speaking about the early beginnings. If you are looking to Manchuria and Ethiopia, it's quite obvious. Not the Germans are the first destruction, the Versailles Order. But it's also, on the other hand, things are getting more complicated because especially in the setting of Southeast Asia, it doesn't end in August 45, but it's going on, and there's a long transimperial history taking place. And I think that's connecting to the question of Louisa. I mean, the basic thing is there isn't any this dichotomy between fascism and anti-fascist force, and quite simple stories, it's very well working with European nation states. If you look to these transimperial hubs in Indochina, for example, it's not working that well anymore. But I have the impression, I'm not sure, but if you are looking to these different stations Curie is using on her journey, and in every chapter, then I would like to look a little bit back why these are transimperial areas and what will happen during the war to these spaces and how the war will end as an imperial war in this region. Then probably you don't have a synchronized narrative, because in the end of the day there are very different settings which are the war is really transforming the transimperial order or the global order, and I have the impression that it's just the basic thing would be to have a more complicated view of what was happening. And some people, for example, Orwell was pointing to this in the late 30s already, that there are other lines of conflict in this global war, and which can't be reduced to Europe. But I don't think that a master narrative, and I don't aim at replacing by a transimperial narrative the European one. The Holocaust will not disappear through this, but it's probably this kind of questions are more connected. But I think that they have to be discussed in regional settings and contexts. Thanks.
Was that? I think the only questions were for Daniel in that row, right? Oh no. Okay, sorry, Alexander. So sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Jenny, for the question. I think you're right that, treaties provide sort of precedents that are, they are remembered. And in fact, in particularly on the sort of imperial frontiers in Asia, the oldest precedents are not agreements with European powers, they are agreements with China, as you know very well. Nerchinsk in 1689, Kyakhta in 1722, which set up actually quite a stable diplomatic relationship that lasts more or less until the middle of the 19th century. What that provides, I think, is a basis for a degree of mutual understanding, which does contribute, for instance, to the peaceful settling of well, at least for the Russians and Chinese, of the Ili crisis, more or less in Qing China's favor. What it doesn't, I think, lead to, though, is a sort of enthusiastic Russian adoption of forms of Chinese statecraft. It doesn't go as far as that. And for some of their Asian neighbors, they basically don't think that these forms of treaty relationships are viable. So the Ottomans and the Persians, yes. Khiva, Kokand, Bukhara, no. And Afghanistan only through British mediation. So there's a definite hierarchy in the way that they view their Asian neighbors there. thinking more broadly about the structures that facilitate inter-imperial transfer in the Russian case, well, I think the single most obvious one is linguistic. It's that Russian elites, particularly in the first half of the 19th century, all know French, and this is the medium through which these ideas tend to make their way towards them. So, for instance, when they read British travel accounts in Central Asia, for instance, Alexander Burns's travels into Bukhara, they read it in French translation. It comes to them through that connection. Later on in the century, I think there's definitely a role that's played by the international structures of Orientalism as a discipline. So the sort of global congresses of Orientalists are very important sites for the transfer of specialist knowledge about things like Islamic law. I'm not certain that's quite so important for the earlier 19th century. But yes, you're quite right that it can't just be about individuals. I also have just remembered I did not fully answer Moritz's question because I have thought of a couple of instances where the Russians are at least showing an interest in camel logistics from other powers. So there's one that's actually mentioned in my paper, which is when General Kuropatkin is sent to Algeria to study French military administration in general, but he actually writes a whole section of his work on the French system of camel breeding, which he advocates the Russians should imitate, but they don't imitate it. And another case is when the Russians show an interest in the experiments the US Army is making using camels for transport in Texas in the 1850s, but again, it just remains on paper. It's not something they ever actually implement in Central Asia. So, thank you.
Thank you. Before we move to the next row, I have a question online, but first I think we have a book brewing on inter-imperial bestiaries. I think that'll be really, it's a nice topic. Okay, so we have an online question from, sorry, I can't see the full name, but Aditya, okay.
No, sorry.
Yep, so we have an online question from Aditya Kiran Kakati, and the question is to Daniel. And Aditya asks if it, or thinks that it might be problematic to even bring the discussion of inter-imperial warfare in terms of good or bad, especially since, despite who were the actors, it was a war on a world scale that caused unmeasurable suffering and lasting post-colonial legacies, especially, for example, in India-Burma, in terms of India-Burma frontiers. Do you have a response?
Yeah, probably a short one. I mean, the basic issue here is that the historiography is full of this kind of different narrative, which normally have really clear positioning and which are working very well in national or binational settings, and then they get much more complicated in this more transimperial thing. I mean, coming back to the question before, how these regions are connected. I mean, she's also visiting the Russian front. So Yves Curie is in Moscow some weeks after the battle for Moscow. So the Eastern Front doesn't disappear, but if you are traveling from Tehran to Moscow, things looks quite different, and what the British are doing there is a quite different story. So, and this story has always been told in a very moralistic sense. So I can't really, I have to address this in some way, but I don't want to tell myself this kind of moralistic story. I just would like to let these transimperial actors or brokers or however you want to call it meet at these places and see what's happening.
Thank you, Daniel. So we're going to quickly jump to Cyrus, he's claiming the right of the king, and then we'll go back to row 7. Cyrus. Martin, are you with us? I think this question's going to be for you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Martin, it's great to have you here. And I'm sorry it didn't quite work out, but I so much enjoyed reading your papers. I'm sure everybody else did. So let me just, have two questions for you, right? And they basically are a part of, what I already wrote. So number one, so you wrote that normally people think about civil wars as having definitive markers of political and social division, and that is fundamental to what makes a civil war, right? The question then I asked is whether rather than these distinctions between different, let's say, ethnies or, groups leading to tension and to civil war, whether civil war itself or war itself creates those, particular divisions. And we have great work out of the late Ottoman period, like, for instance, İpek Osmanoğlu's Blood Ties, Religion, Violence, and the Politics of Nationhood, which basically makes exactly this case, right? So could we see something of this happening in decolonization civil wars too? Question number 2, World War II roots of what's going on here, right? So let me connect to Alexander Kese's paper earlier today about the, intensification of forced labor in the Second World War. Somebody else, I think actually Aidan, it was a colleague of mine here, Aidan Russell, told me that just after the Second World War and into the 1950s, in a case like Kenya, Kikuyu leaders' recruitment of forced labor became so strong that it helped to trigger the Kikuyu civil war within the Mau Mau insurgency, right? So are there certain roots, internal roots, that are in the Second World War? The second case of the Second World War would be issues of intelligence, propaganda, and psychological warfare, because on the part of the imperial powers, right? Because this is something that all sorts of different, armies do a great deal in the Second World War. The Americans, I think, perhaps most particularly. So, are there patterns that are set in motion in the Second World War, also in this case, that help to then, lead to similar sort of, policies in the decolonization wars? And thank you so much again for being here.
Hi, Cyrus. Thank you for those questions, and thanks for your patience, really. I'm afraid I'm not there, and I wish I was. And I'm so sorry I couldn't deliver the paper properly. My apologies. To answer your question about civil wars first, the basic point I would make is that yes, civil wars are much more contingent and much more dynamic than that suggestion that they only begin once there are sort of definitive levels of intercommunal or interethnic, interreligious, whatever it might be, division. One of the factors that emerges so strongly from the wave of comparative politics research on civil wars that particularly arise in late colonial and post-colonial settings is that actually the variations in violence within and between them are so strongly determined by the continuing shifts, in other words, the dynamism of local allegiances, and that the primary determinants of those local allegiances are nothing really to do with, if you like, what we might imagine as those preeminent divisions within a community, whether they be religion or ethnicity, etc. They are much more to do with questions of security and insecurity. And that's where I think the secondary issue that I did raise in those questions I asked myself is really one about paramilitarism, because another determinant feature of civil wars is the prevalence of paramilitarism and the proliferation, if you like, of violence actors who themselves are very contingent. Sometimes they are organized into what you might call violence or acting groups, but very much more often, I think, their violence is much more episodic and much more determined by those questions of security and insecurity. So I'm sorry if I gave the impression that there's a sort of clear point at which one makes the tilt into civil war. That's not quite what I meant. It's interesting, of course, in that connection that in some of the instances I study in the paper, and that I'll perhaps send the paper so that people can see it in full, particularly, of course, in Angola and Mozambique, the civil war dynamics of decolonization are already playing out well before the formal decolonization occurs. And of course, that is something that one could make an equally sort of comparable observation about, whether it be in regard to French Algeria or in regard to British Kenya, which you just mentioned. And there, You mentioned the sort of the relevance of forced labour regimes in determining sort of patterns of allegiance and, to some extent, patterns of opposition to the colonial state. I complicate that a little bit in that it works, I think, across the Gikuyu and the squatter and non-squatter divide. And it's determined by additional factors such as religious revivalism, the levels of infrastructure development in particular regions of the Kenyan Highlands. So all of which is really, again, just point to the sort of dynamism and the multiplicity of factors that are at play in determining those civil war dynamics, but they're certainly there. Similarly, linking up with Alex's paper, which I thought was tremendous this morning, and that whole question of the sort of lasting legacies of forced labour, one of the commentators in an earlier panel made the comment about a sort of 1940s and onwards shift towards a more developmental late colonialism, which of course was very highly structured, not just on socioeconomic factors, but in particular on infrastructure development. And infrastructure development becomes one of the critical sources, I would suggest, of instances of violence, both in terms of its ecological impacts, its agricultural impacts, its human impacts, and in particular the fact that ecological building creates obvious targets for insurgents to go for. Finally, in regard to your question about intelligence, propaganda, psychological warfare, and the kind of World War II route, yes, I mean, I think those are very evident. In a sense, I think that fits a much longer-term trend, and it's why I'm sorry I missed my colleagues' papers, really, because I rather suspect that it was evident within them too. And it's been mentioned already by some of the commentators and panelists, and that's the danger of kind of information orders in which somehow intelligence is privileged, even though, as pretty well every paper I've been listening to over the past 2 days seems to confirm, that colonial sources of intelligence really need to be treated with immense skepticism and disaggregated and then questioned. So I think that intelligence and cyber, in a sense, are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, now we're going to row 7. Yes, thank you.
So no answer necessary, just a short comment to Alexander. I just would go very much with you that what you say, that the Russians took information from other European powers in war, and they saw themselves and were classed as a European powers. From what I saw in my research, they went to the American-Cuban War and had a military attaché there, Oberst Yarmolov. He was a military attaché of the Russian embassy in Washington, and they went together with other people. They went to other wars. They were on the sort of the European side. Also in this Institut Colonial International, the Russians were on the European side, and they didn't pay attention so much at the Japanese people who were seen as a different class, a different race. And so I think I would just support what you wrote in your paper, that there wasn't so much transfer from China or Japan.
Thank you. And Shul?
I think one of the symbols of the fact that Professor Biltoft is moderating this panel is the fact that while knowledge usually moves from the global north to the south, this panel is moving from south to the north. I mean, the questions are coming from the global south to the global north, and that's why this particular row had to wait so much. Daniel, my question is for you. Daniel, my question is for you. While there is this conversation about Europe and the fascist history and all of those as well, in the people you cited, Gandhi and Nehru, yes, very important. But what about Jinnah? He is a person who would fit absolutely in your entire ways of nuancing this question between the imperial and the national. He manages to, in 1942, he manages to not participate in Gandhi's Quit India movement. He manages to keep his party out of it. He manages to keep millions of Muslims out of the entire question of the Quit India movement and the nationalist struggle which Nehru and Gandhi are leading together. And he also manages to befriend the British during this period to involve him in all the conversations about partition later on. In fact, this is the period when he's at his peak of performance as well. So if we are thinking of trans-imperial histories of the Second World War, where is Jinnah in that story? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Go ahead, Daniel. You can.
Yeah, that's a very challenging, but I think important question. As far as I remember, she had Eve herself not the opportunity to meet him. So I was first sticking with this people she was meeting. But she's writing, when I remember, quite a lot about the Muslim League and what this would mean. And also in connection, because she's twice in India. She's coming from Persia and from the Middle East to India, and then from the other side. I have just, I think, to look more closely how she is dealing with this issue. But I have the impression for her, it was especially the meeting with Gandhi, which was so important because her mother was an admirer of him. So that this is probably this European setting, how to look at India, and then other things aren't seen. But thank you very much to pointing at this, and it remembers me that I have to take a closer look to every station of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Anshul. Okay. Members of row 8.
Hello. This is a question for Daniel that I think his short intervention was brilliant. Of the book. As an existence of the concept of transimperialism, how do you see the alliance of the axes? Of course, in opposition, as we know, there was the Marxist concept, Russia, China, and the growing power of America based on the liberalism and so on. Because as you know, those three are quite different concepts. I mean, fascism, Nazism, and Japanese nationalism. So if you agree, how will you describe the possibilities of their alliance, except the fact that they were anti-communist, most of them?
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Okay, I have a comment to Alexander first and then to Vladimir. Alexander, when answering a question why millet system was not applied to the Jews in the Roman Empire, well, I would say that from the point when the empire got some Jews after the first partition, 1772, until well into the middle of the 19th century, they did apply exactly millet system, because when they got these portions of Polish Commonwealth, they were preparing, I mean the Poles, were preparing to abolish the Kahal. But the Romanovs kept the Kahal for another several decades, just in order to prevent Poles from controlling this community. And now to Vladimir, a question or maybe a kind of hesitation about research strategy, because I don't think that it is by chance that you have skipped the question asked by Ron. Do you have any evidence of influence in the cases you described? Because on the one, there is one possibility that you want to compare or you want to look at entanglement because you want to prove the existence of this entanglement. And there is another approach when you want to compare in order to find out what is happening and to find possible influences. Because if you follow the second one, then you ask who could influence and how the strategy of the Ottomans in 1915 and of course, the Russian part of the story is there. But what about German officers who were embedded in the Ottoman army at that period and who probably were aware of the experience with Guerrero just 8 years earlier, which perfectly fits what Ottomans were doing in 1915, while comparing what was happening to the Jews in the Romanov Empire and what was happening to Armenians in the Ottoman Empire in the 90s, is questionable in a sense that we are talking about two very different communities. Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire, in the places where it suffered this violence, was mostly rural, while Jewish communities who were suffering pogroms were urban, and the mechanisms were quite different. So the question is why you imply this comparative approach, in order to get to proper questions or in order to get to the answers which you want to get.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question here.
A short question to Vladimir to bring back the North Africans in the story. You cannot cover all the populations indeed, but after 1830, indeed, the Algerians are leaving Algeria with the French coming and with the French colonial violence. But indeed, they are not refugees, they are exiled people because they were Ottoman subjects. But my question is much more, did they have interactions with the other people, with the refugees from the Caucasus? Because that will open up a new kind of transimperial history and this kind of interactions between North Africans and people from the Caucasus or from the Balkans. Thank you so much.
Okay. So this collective brain trust has literally 60 seconds before we conclude. So do you want to take final remarks, final questions? We'll go ahead and... No, there's more questions. Okay. So we might have to leave some of these to the break, but we're going to have to leave the questions to the break. Sorry, Cyrus, is that correct? Okay. Did you mean it's fine to leave them to the break, or it's fine to ask? Oh, it's fine to go on. Wait, what's my answer? We're good? Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll just collect from the audience. Maybe one collection and then we'll let them respond, and then we'll go have our coffee. Okay? Sound good?
Yeah, this comment, it's a question. It's for Daniel. I really like the flying boat, and I think there's actually a trans as well as inter-imperial history to be written about that, particularly if you think about the various stations where they had to stop, and that the British route to India was still using not airfields, the Lago di Bracciano in Italy, like on the eve of the Second World War, basically. But that was just a comment, and I think that's something that could do with some attention. My question is about the chronology point, and I was just wondering if thinking of moving this forward, because I think your point about saying, well, there are different, depending on your perspective, there are different stories to be told here. I was thinking about Tim Harper and Chris Bailey's Forgotten Wars and Forgotten Armies books. So my question would be, how far do you want to go forward with this sort of long Second World War? Because they take the British Empire perspective, so in that sense it's sort of limited and you get this Asian story, or East Asian, Southeast Asian story. But if you take a Transimperial perspective, where do you stop? Which is not necessarily that I think to limit it, but just to sort of out of curiosity, where do you draw the line in the end?
Thank you, Annabelle. Okay, so can everyone that has remaining questions raise their hands just so the question...
I will try just to be very quick with two questions for Martin, who hopefully still hears us. So thank you for this wonderful paper, the written version, with all these possibilities and shrewd links between the different counterinsurgency theaters. I just wanted to ask you, well, first of all, there was something I don't yet really understand, which is a link to the Biafran case, because it has become kind of a classic idea to look at French and Portuguese counterinsurgency and to link those and see who learns from whom. But in the Biafran case, of course, the French and the Portuguese are supporting the secessionists. So I don't yet understand how that fits together. And the second point is about strategies of reflection, which have to do with the politically incorrect option that those who practice counterinsurgency might at some point develop real empathy with problems on the ground, in spite of all the repression and the brutality in warfare against anti-colonial movements. So, for example, in Angola, that the fact that those who are involved in counterinsurgency measures start to denounce forced labor and to say, well, there are continuities of that here, this cannot be. It might be strategic in the first place, but then one clearly notices that it becomes kind of internalized. And how do you deal with that?
Thank you. So we're going to let Martin respond first, and then we'll return to the physically present panelists. Okay, Martin?
Hi, thank you. I'm the strange disembodied voice, but thank you for bearing with me. Thank you, Alex, for your question. First of all, about Biafra, where does it fit? You're right, it fits rather differently, if at all. My key interest, though, is in the kind of clash between very intense French involvement in setting up arms supplies and land corridors, and the equal prominence of French NGOs, transnational campaign groups, in highlighting the sort of gathering humanitarian tragedy and the famine, particularly child famine, in Biafra in 68, 69. So in a sense, the point of that conclusion from the sort of trans-imperial viewpoint is that the French dichotomy, if you like, between public sphere intervention and governmental and particularly military intervention is so very pronounced, and that's not really evident in the case of the other primary external interveners in that conflict, particularly the British and the Soviets. Second point about strategies of reflection and whether somehow coin practitioners see themselves as sort of the classic armed social worker argument. You're quite right, of course, that they like to claim they are in multiple instances, and as you say, very often become quite fervent opponents of labour regimes that they think are hampering their own activities to rebuild particularly loyalist communities. I'm pretty sceptical about that, perhaps not surprisingly. I tend to see it as fitting much more in that wider sort of vein of historiography about the triumph of experts and the danger of expertise and the sort of fallacies of expertise in late colonial settings. So my only point to make there, I would suggest, is that actually I don't take those claims on the part of counterinsurgency thinkers and doers, if you like, very seriously. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, other panelists?
Alexei, thank you so much for your comments. So this paper is an intellectual experiment on trying to work things out and to see how we can view migration and violence in this transimperial context. On what is happening in the late 19th century, of course, Armenian and Jewish communities, very different. But what I'm interested in seeing is how the two governments viewed them and how they gradually dehumanized them and placed them outside of the pale of protection. And I think there's important similarities. For the Armenian genocide, absolutely, there are many sources, there are many origins of the Armenian genocide. I think it would be doing a disservice not to seeking some of the origins of the genocide in a much much longer time frame. But thank you so much. Mohammed, on Algerian migrants and refugees of French colonialism to the Ottoman Empire, many Algerians were settled in Damascus in the 1840s and 1850s, and I would say that the Ottomans, when they worked out the accommodations for those Algerian immigrants, it was that's how they started practicing settling people, which would become important for them much later. And in your paper, there's of course this connection Abdul Qadir and Imam Shamil, who were in correspondence with each other. So there was also that kind of anti-colonial, anti-Russian, anti-French solidarity between those two groups.
Thank you.
Just very briefly to respond to Alexei. I mean, I'm not an Ottomanist, but my understanding of the millet system, it's not just that you take religion as the main organizing principle for governance, but that you govern communities through their religious hierarchies, which the Russians did do, obviously, for Orthodox and Muslim communities, but I'm not aware that they did so for Jewish communities, but maybe I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's very different than the Ottoman. There's no pale of settlement or ghettos for Jews. I mean, it's a very different approach to Jews, which are like a model minority in the Ottoman context.
Do you imagine what is the scale of the pale of settlement? I mean, how big it is? Because we are now operating with some stereotypes. The Pale of Settlement covers all the territory of contemporary Ukraine, all the territory of contemporary Belarus, and most of the territory, and all the territory of the eastern Poland. It's twice bigger than France. So it's not a ghetto. It's not a Venetian ghetto.
But the Jews in the Ottoman Empire are the model millets. They're the ones that are seen in, as the preeminent millet, more than Armenians or the Greeks. So there is a very different way of incorporating Jews into the Ottoman Empire, right? So I mean, I think that there is a pretty big difference, and also the ideas of in Islam that that people of the book are guaranteed, that they are accorded a type of protection. I think also informs the different approaches of the empires to the ways that they rule people. And we can maybe we can talk after.
I think Daniel has a question to answer, and then we'll go towards the
Thank you very much
snacks.
for the two questions. I mean, the flying boats, there's a whole history of civil colonial aviation that turned over to warfare, and I think there isn't that much literature about this, and it's so interesting because the United States are coming in, and their clippers are much bigger, much more comfortable than the other ones. So there's a competition also on this level, and I will look into this. Concerning the chronologies, I mean, Overy has now written a book about inter-imperial history of the Second World War. He's starting, or he's giving, even in the title, the numbers 31 to 45, so quite a short end, but a long beginning. But I don't believe that the Second World War started in or with Manchuria. What I more see is different beginnings and different endings, and it's all coming together in 1941 in the context of Pearl Harbor and the final solution and the real globalization of the war. And so I would look in every chapter probably back and forth without having one departing point and one ending point, because it doesn't make sense obviously it's going far back, and you can even go back to the 19th century in some cases, but I wouldn't prefer to think about beginnings and endings, and the core of the argument would always be these crucial months from late 41 to late 42, when some of the most important decisions of this war were taken. And concerning the other question, the alliance, and I mean the basic story has always been that there was not a real alliance. It was like a paper tiger. It didn't work out, and on the level of the ideologies, they were very different. And what I try to show in the book is that there is probably more variation over time in one country on the level of ideology than in between them. And what you can see is a process, or I believe what you can see is a process of mutual radicalization taking place. For example, when Manchuria is occupied, the geopolitical thing happening in East Asia, this is translated ideologically. In Germany, for example, where people are then starting to think about how one could connect to the Japanese. So also this will be a longer process, but I think it's very important if we look at this global fascism, that we look at the imperial background of it. And I mean, it's very hard for them to reinvent imperialism in the war years and to give new models, but they are trying really hard. And I would argue by mid-1942, you really see difference, and the fascist empires, which are then at their greatest expansion at some point, look very different. And they believe and they recognize each other in this kind of new empire building.
Thank you.
Even in the end, it didn't work out, luckily, at all. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you to all our panelists, to the amazing questions. Martin, ghostly voice, thank you as well. We have a short break, and then we'll come back. So what do you want to say? 20 minutes, 15? Okay. Thanks, everyone.